In the year 536, the sun went dark, not for an afternoon, not for an eclipse, for more than a year, across the whole of the known world. The sun gave a feeble, bluish light, dim enough that, in daylight, a man cast no shadow. The crops failed, snow fell in summer, famine followed, and the people who lived through it wrote in genuine terror that they did not know what they had done to make the sky abandon them. This is not a legend. It is one of the best documented disasters of the ancient world. Writers from the Mediterranean to the Middle East recorded the dimming of the sun in the year 536, and in the centuries since, scientists have found the same event, frozen into the ice of Greenland and locked inside the growth rings of ancient trees on 3 continents. The catastrophe is real. The evidence is everywhere. But for 1,500 years, one question went unanswered. What exactly put out the sun? Start with the people who were there. In the 6th century, the Mediterranean world was still literate, still connected, still writing things down, and several of those writers recorded the same astonishing event. A Byzantine historian named Procopius wrote that during this year, the sun gave its light without brightness, like the moon, for the entire year, and that it looked, he said, very much like the sun. In eclipse, he was not alone. Another writer of the time, a statesman named Cassiodorus, described a sun that shone a strange, bluish color, gave no warmth, and seemed dim, as if exhausted. He wrote of frost in summer and seasons all jumbled out of order, of a year, he said, without a proper summer. Sources from the Middle East and beyond echo it: a darkness, a veil over the sun, a cold that would not lift. Different writers, different languages, different countries, the same dimmed sky now by itself. Ancient testimony has limits. People exaggerate. Chroniclers borrow from each other. A frightened writer may turn a hard winter into the end of the world. For a long time, cautious historians treated the 536 accounts with exactly that suspicion. Maybe it was real, maybe it was overblown. There was no way to be sure. The written word alone could not settle it. What was needed was a witness that could not exaggerate and could not lie. Let's set the timeline precisely, because precision is exactly what makes this story extraordinary. The event begins in the year 536 of the Common Era. That is roughly 1,500 years ago. And here is what is so unusual. For an ancient catastrophe, we can date it not to a century, not to a decade, but, in some records, to the very year. How? Through 2 of the most remarkable archives in all of science, archives that nature itself keeps. The first is tree rings. Every year, a tree adds a ring of new growth. In a good year, warm, wet, sunny, the ring is wide. In a bad year, cold, dark, starved of light, the ring is narrow. By matching the ring patterns of living trees, dead trees, and ancient timber, scientists have built continuous, year-by-year records of growth, stretching back thousands of years. It is a calendar written in wood, and the tree rings are unambiguous across the northern hemisphere. In trees from Europe, from Asia, from North America, the rings show it. Beginning in 536, there is a sharp, severe collapse in growth. The trees nearly stopped. Cold, dark years, one after another. And it did not end quickly. The tree ring evidence shows that the years following 536 were among the coldest of the last several thousand years. The decade that began in that dark year may have been the single coldest decade in millennia. Now to the second archive. And it is, if anything, even more powerful. The ice in Greenland and Antarctica. Snow falls year after year and never fully melts. It compresses layer upon layer into ice. And that ice preserves, in order, a record of the sky. Above it, scientists drill long cylinders of this ice cores, and read them like a book. Each layer holds the air, the dust, and the chemistry of the year it fell. And one thing the ice records with brutal clarity is volcanic eruptions, because when a great volcano erupts, it flings sulfur high into the atmosphere, and that sulfur eventually settles onto the ice as a distinct, datable chemical spike. And when scientists examined the ice core record around the year 536, they found exactly that, a massive sulfur signal, the chemical fingerprint of an enormous volcanic eruption. And then, this is the part that matters. They found another one, a second great eruption, just a few years later, around 540, and evidence suggests possibly a third, not long after, not one volcano. A cluster of them, a rapid series of colossal eruptions, one on top of another, hammering the sky again and again. So now, the two archives line up. The ice says a series of titanic volcanic eruptions starting in 536. The tree rings say a sudden, severe, years-long collapse of growth starting in 536. And the human chronicles say the sun went dark, the seasons failed, starting in 536. Three completely independent witnesses, written history, ancient wood, and polar ice, all pointing at the same year and telling the same story. Let's explain the mechanism, because it is both simple and terrifying. When a truly enormous volcano erupts, it does not just throw out lava and ash. It injects sulfur gases high into the stratosphere, far above the weather, above the clouds and the rain that would normally wash them out. Up there, that sulfur turns into a fine haze of tiny droplets, an aerosol veil that spreads on the high winds around the entire planet. And that veil does something dreadful. It reflects sunlight back into space before it can reach the ground. The Earth's surface is, in effect, put into shade, not for a day, but for years, until the haze finally settles out. Scientists call the result a volcanic winter. The sun looks dim and wan and bluish. It gives less warmth. Temperatures fall. Summers turn cold. Frost and snow arrive in the wrong months. And the growing season, the narrow window when crops can ripen, collapses. Now imagine that happening, not once, but in a chain. One gigantic eruption in 536 casts the first veil. Before the world can recover, before the haze fully clears, another colossal eruption around 540 throws up a second veil. The shade never lifts. The cold compounds. The bad years do not get a chance to become good years again. This is why the decade after 536 was so catastrophically cold. The planet was struck, and struck again before it could catch its breath. Now let's talk about what this did to the people, because a volcanic winter is not an abstraction. It is hunger. It is the failure of the harvest, year after year after year, for a world almost entirely dependent on agriculture. A collapsed growing season meant famine, and the historical record from many regions tells of exactly that. In the years after 536, crop failure, food shortage, hunger, and the desperation that hunger brings. People in the 530 seconds did not understand volcanic aerosols. They had no way to know that a mountain on the other side of the world had darkened their sky. They only knew that the sun had failed them, that the cold would not break, and that their children were going hungry. And then it got worse. Because just a few years into this catastrophe, beginning around the year 541, one of the deadliest pandemics in all of human history swept across the world. It is called the Plague of Justinian. It tore through the Mediterranean and far beyond, killing, by many estimates, a vast portion of the populations it reached. Now, historians are careful here. We cannot say with certainty that the volcanic winter caused the plague, but the timing is haunting a population already weakened by years of famine, already stressed, already hungry, is a population terribly vulnerable to disease. So stack the blows together. A darkened sun, a volcanic winter, years of failed harvests, famine, and then a colossal pandemic striking a starved and exhausted world. Many historians now argue that the years around 536 mark one of the genuine turning points of human history, a moment when the late ancient world was so badly shaken that the shape of everything after it was changed. Some have called the 530 seconds the beginning of the worst period to be alive in recorded history, and it began with the dimming of the sun. Now we come to the strangest part of the whole story, not the catastrophe itself, but what happened to the memory of it. You would think that a disaster on this scale, the sun darkened for a year and more, a volcanic winter, famine, a world-changing plague, would be seared into human memory forever, that it would be the most famous catastrophe of the ancient world. But for most of the last 1,500 years, it was not. The event of 536 was scattered across a handful of chronicles, half noticed, half believed, never assembled into the single, enormous picture we can see today. Why was it forgotten? Several reasons, and they are sobering. First, the people who lived through it did not understand it. They had no concept of a distant volcano dimming their sky without an explanation. The event had no name, no clear cause, no story to be passed down as a single, coherent thing. Second, it struck a world that was already fragmenting. Literacy was contracting in places. Records were not always kept, or not always survived. And third, the very horror of it may have worked against memory. A society fighting famine and plague is fighting to survive, not to document. It took modern science to recover the memory. It was only in recent decades, as researchers read the tree rings, drilled the ice cores, and cross-checked them against the scattered old chronicles, that the full scale of 536 finally came into focus. We did not inherit the memory of this catastrophe from the people who suffered it. We had to dig it back up out of the wood, out of the ice, out of forgotten manuscripts, and reassemble it like a shattered pot. One of the greatest disasters in human history had to be rediscovered before we close. There is one more thing that has to be said, and it is the part of this story that is not about the past at all. The eruptions of 536 and 540 were not unique. They were not a one-time flaw in an otherwise stable world. They were simply what the planet does. Volcanic eruptions of that scale, eruptions capable of dimming the sun and triggering a volcanic winter, have happened many times across human history, and they will, with absolute certainty, happen again. The only thing we do not know is when, and here is the uncomfortable thought. In some ways, we are better prepared than the people of 536. We understand the mechanism. We monitor volcanoes. We could see a great eruption coming, and we would know immediately why the sky had dimmed. But in other ways, we are far more exposed. The world of 536 was a patchwork of local farms, feeding local people. Our world is a single, tightly woven global system where the food on one continent depends on the harvests, the shipping, and the stability of every other. A multi-year volcanic winter striking that system would not be a local famine. It would be a global one. So 536 is not only history, it is a rehearsal. It is the planet showing us, in the clearest possible terms, something it is fully capable of doing again. The people of the 6th century could not have known what was coming and could not have prepared. We do not have that excuse. The lesson of 536 is not that the sky once went dark. The lesson is that the sky can go dark, that it has, that it will, and that the only real question is whether we are paying attention. Here is what I keep coming back to. This whole channel is about the things that came before history, the events, the people, the catastrophes that shaped us, but that we forgot. And 536 is the perfect and the most frightening example, because this was not the deep, dim, prehistoric past. This was a literate world, a world that wrote things down. And even so, even with witnesses, even with chronicles, the true scale of the disaster slipped through our fingers for 1,500 years. If a catastrophe this enormous could be nearly forgotten, a catastrophe that darkened the sun and helped reshape the late ancient world, then think of everything older. Think of the catastrophes that struck before anyone could write it all. The eruptions, the impacts, the climate collapses that fell on peoples with no chronicles, no ice cores being read, no one to remember them. The human story is not a smooth climb. It is a series of recoveries from blows we mostly do not even know we were struck. The year the sun went dark is a message from before history, written in tree rings, sealed in ice, half remembered in trembling chronicles. And the message is this: the earth is not a stable stage on which our story safely unfolds. It is an active, dangerous, world-changing force, and it has dimmed the sun on us before. Before history, the sky went out. The people who lived through it never understood why. We finally do. The only thing left to learn is whether we will remember In time, if this episode shifted something in your head, about how fragile our world really is, about how easily even a documented catastrophe can be forgotten, then know that 536 is only one such turning point among many. Volcanic winters, ancient impacts, sudden climate collapses are scattered all through the deep human story, an entire history of catastrophe and recovery, most of it unremembered, waiting in the ice and the wood and the stone. If you want to come along as we recover what the Earth did to us, subscribe to Before History, because the further back we look, the more we find we have already survived. See you in the next one. Yes, embedded in closing VO. No cadence promise.